It's Max Weinberg. Good morning, Max. It's Jim and Dave.
Hello, guys. Jim, Dave, good to talk to you this morning on what is a reflective day on the incredible life and legacy of Hal Blaine. You know, I've been thinking about him constantly.
Well, I know you certainly were the first person I thought of yesterday, because you transmitted your love of him to me, as you very well know.
Well, I do remember it very well. You know, back in 1978, we were playing out in L.A., and actually we had played at the Forum. Dave, you'll remember this.
Mm-hmm.
There. We played at the Forum. I think it was
on
July 4th.
The Forum and the Roxy, I think.
Yes, and then the Roxy. And we had a day off in between. And you may remember Harvey Kubernick. Harvey Kubernick was an L.A. music maven, and he called me up and said, "Would you like to meet Hal Blaine?" This is in 1978. And I said, "Would I like to? I'd be thrilled." So he picked me up, and he took me to Hal's house at the time, which was in an area of Los Angeles called Los Feliz, and it was sort of a big brick mansion. And we were invited in by, I think, a houseman, and taken to Hal's office. And, of course, you know, I'd idolized him ever since, you know, August of 63 when I first heard boom, boom, boom on the radio, my little transistor radio. And we went into his office, and what struck me, Dave and Jim, was that, and Dave, I think I've told you this, but in his office, it was a big office, instead of wallpaper, every inch of wall space was filled with side-by-side, top to bottom, gold singles.
No, you never told me this before.
I didn't.
No.
Hundreds of gold singles.
We were talking about how he played and stuff, and I never got to this level. This is fantastic.
It was unbelievable. You know, he was sitting behind the desk, and you know, he was probably 50, I guess, maybe. It was 1978, and he was as gracious.
Yeah, he was 90
nice.
When he died, so yeah,
he was 90.
Pretty much exactly
right.
that.
Well, he was as gracious as he could be. You know, we sat there for a couple of hours listening to his stories based on the questions I was asking him. The next day, we played at this small little nightclub called the Roxy.
Mm-hmm.
Then the day after that,
we flew to Phoenix.
I came back to the Roxy and told Bruce and everybody, "Whoa, you're not going to believe it! I met Hal Blaine," and everybody was really impressed with that. And of course, Hal was as active as ever back in those days. But the next day, we flew to Phoenix, and you and I sat together, Dave, on the plane, and I was telling you the stories about meeting Hal, and you suggested. It's fantastic. You should write a book. And that was the genesis of that.
He means that he should write a book.
That I should.
Because I'd already had one out, but yeah. Well, it was very obvious that you knew more about this and could put it into written form more than. Is that book still available?
I think it's sort of online someplace.
You can find it. You can find it in used bookstores, whatever.
Edition, but. You know, Hal couldn't have been nicer. But the thing is with me and Hal, and a lot of people have this story, but I feel very much like Hal has been in my life every day since then, because what people don't know about Hal was when the internet became pervasive, Hal became, as he got older, a unbelievably connected transmitter of jokes to people who were on his email blast list. And if you look at the list, it's incredible because it's everybody, you know, through the years, it's been everybody he ever played with, celebrities he knew, and I was honored and fortunate to be on the list. So I would say for the last 20 years, I have gotten 3 or 4 emails a week with Hal's new jokes. And as you probably have read, Hal had this blowout 90th birthday party on February 5th at a place called the Baked Potato, which is a little jazz club in Hollywood, and right across from Universal Studios. And I couldn't make it out there. I was working, but Hal and I had a conversation shortly after that, and he was such a laid-back guy, and he was such a real fount of grace, you know, just a sweet gentleman with the accent on gentle. And, you know, it's reflected in his drumming because he had this incredibly propulsive beat, but contained within that beat was this unbelievable relaxation. He always thought it had something to do with living in the sunshine of California, having grown up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, with snow and, you know, rain and sleet and ice. And when he got out to California in the late 50s, he felt he always just blossomed. So Hal has been one of those guys who, you know, when I got on TV, he would watch the show to see me drum, and he would send me postcards.
It must have kept you on your toes.
Well, you know, of course it did.
Not that you weren't anyway.
Half the material he was the drummer on, and you know, it's an offset. And I think Bruce Gary, the late great drummer for the Knack, once said in print, and I've repeated it, that the most shocking day of his young career was when he found out that 50 of his favorite drummers were Hal Blaine, and that's how I felt. As Bruce has said many times, that opening snare shot in Like a Rolling Stone for him was sort of the key to what opened up his universe. Well, I was at summer camp in the summer of '63 with a little transistor radio when I first heard Be My Baby. And I'd been playing drums. But that moment when I heard boom, 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 which I've stolen millions of times on various records, including a Meatloaf record, which was cited recently, that for me was kind of opening the door to my drumming imagination. Because before that, I wasn't quite, you know, a little Dixieland, a little jazzy stuff, you know, a little twist music. But when I heard that and the impact of the drums, that was it for me. We were off to the races.
Yeah, well, the thing, I spent yesterday mostly listening to Hal Blaine music. You're not surprised to hear. And the thing that got me was you could tell what his best records were because often he was way in the background at the beginning. And then suddenly he would burst on the scene. It was like he had oxygen or life or something to distribute to your ears.
Well, he picked his spots. That's Jim Keltner and I have spoken about this. Al had the uncanny ability to, I don't want to get too deep into the technical aspects of drumming, but he had this uncanny ability to be able to kind of put the perfect little fill or pickup in these interstitial spaces between a verse and a chorus, or a singer's phrase even. One of the most beautiful 8 bars that he ever played was the flute solo in California Dreamin' by the Mamas and Papas. It's only 8 bars. But he does these accents that are just perfect. He doesn't just play through the song. He uses the drums as a rhythmic counterpoint to the melody. And this stuff was instinctive with him. And there was really no template, to a large degree, for the level of professionalism that he and, for example, Earl Palmer, who was his colleague and, was the guy that actually got him started in L.A. recording when Earl moved out there in the late 50s.
From New Orleans, so people know.
From New Orleans, the great New Orleans drummer who played on, also did later Phil Spector records. But, Hal was, as I said in his notices as of yesterday, he was the go-to guy. Jim Keltner has said, if you wanted to work in Los Angeles from 1965 through 1975, you had to sound like Hal Blaine. And if you listen to Jim playing on Just My Style by Gary Lewis, that's Jim doing Hal Blaine. Very often in the studio with Bruce and Steve and John Landau, the unwritten signal to me was somebody, it could be Bruce, it could be Steve, it could be John, said, play Hal. Which would indicate to me those wild endings, or like a big boom, 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 boom triplet thing at the end of a song. No doubt that Bruce's The Girls in Their Summer Clothes was, I just channeled Hal Blaine. And, as I said, I've been in his company actually physically, I think 3 times. The first time I met him, the second time was in 1980, and if you can believe it, he came to we did as you know, a concert in the LA Sports Arena in 1980 on the River Tour for the Vietnam veterans. And at that show was Hal and Earl Palmer as my guests. Both of them came to that show.
I don't think you ever told me this one.
I may not have, but that was the only time that either one of them had seen Bruce and the E Street Band. And coincidentally, it was also the night that Jim Keltner brought Ringo and Bob Dylan to the show. And so I was surrounded by this just enormous amount of, talent and my very obvious hero worship of these individuals who had, such an impact on, obviously, the world at large musically, but me personally, because I use their abilities and their artistry as a template. One that, in my view, I have never quite reached, but I'm always reaching for that kind of standard that, a guy like Hal Blaine established. It was a great article. I remember I must have been about 20, maybe not even 20. Look magazine, the old pictorial magazine, had a cover of Hal Blaine standing next to his Rolls Royce. And with a headline of like the highest paid musician in the world. And this is a guy who was largely unknown, even to me at the time. I didn't put it together that he was also the drummer for the Byrds, for the Mamas and Papas, because they didn't list the credits generally.
No.
I did know he played on Johnny Rivers Live at the Whiskey a Go-Go.
All the Johnny hits.
Everything in L.A., all the Johnny Rivers hits.
And Johnny's great discovery, the Fifth Dimension.
And the Fifth Dimension, yeah. And so much of that. My favorite story about Hal Blaine came, not to me, but came through some drummer who, it may have been Jim Keltner, who told me Phil Spector, there was a Phil Spector session, and they were handing out the charts for the song. And they gave Hal his chart. And on the chart, sheet music, it 11 by 14 size. It was completely empty, except at the top it said, "Hal, do your thing, Phil." So he didn't need a chart. He was the chart. When you see, there's a great picture in my book that I dug up someplace of where Hal was set up on those his drums on those Spector sessions, and he was right in the middle of all the musicians.
It had to be, right?
And of course, it's great. Yeah, I mean, he was just the touchstone and the linchpin for the Wrecking Crew, a name that he came up with, and not because they were boisterous, because these guys were the ultimate in professionals. All of them, and Kyle Kay. The Wrecking Crew, because they came in casual. They had T-shirts and jeans, sneakers. So the professional musicians who always dressed up, basically, you had to in those days. You even had the engineers wearing lab coats. So they were the Wrecking Crew because they had wrecked the establishment of the recording scene in L.A. at the time, which was a huge, huge industry, and likewise in New York. And this was in the early 60s. Once the sort of English invasion occurred, things did get a little bit more relaxed. Not that much more relaxed, actually. Even when
more competitive, right?
Well, it did get more competitive, but Hal reigned above everybody. I mean, he was so busy. He sometimes did 8 sessions a day. He would just go from one to the next. And, when I was at his house, he kept a record, as did Jim Keltner, has a book of every session he ever did. Hal had every single, he was the leader and contractor, which meant he technically through the union hired all the guys. He had a copy of every contract, of every session, how much he made. And this was when he was making several $1,000s a day in 1964. And he was top of the pops, so to speak. And a lovely story is that I once asked him. It's not in my book, but I asked him. He replaced so many drummers who were in bands on record because Byrds, great example. Terry Melcher, everybody wanted to use Al, and he said, well, he was always very sensitive to the inner dynamics of rock bands when rock bands started becoming the thing in recording, and he was called to replace drummers on a session, and they were very disappointed that they didn't get to play on some of the earlier records, for example. But he was always very sensitive to that. They're going to go out, they're going to play these songs live. And Hal was a jazz drummer. He wanted to be Gene Krupa or Buddy Rich. That he found his niche in pop drumming and rock drumming. But when he played on those records, he was sensitive to that. Well, these guys are going to have to go out and play it, so he's not going to do anything that would be difficult for them to play. And I thought that was extremely gracious. He was the epitome of what John, our mutual dear friend John Landau, said about the singer and the song. That's where you put the emphasis, on the singer and the song. Nobody's buying, except with the exception of maybe "Be My Baby." I'm not sure anybody ever bought a record for the drumming.
Well, when I was listening yesterday, I thought to myself, well, I know what the first two great records, if you're going to rank Hal's songs, it's you got "Be My Baby" and you got that Be My, and then the Beach Boys one, which Don't Worry Baby. So I thought was the third one, and the first thing that came to mind, I don't know if this will make you laugh or hate me, was Dead Man's Curve, because he plays the shit out of that.
Oh yeah, the Dead
Man's Curve. But the first almost a minute of the thing, he's not doing much at all, and then all of a sudden he explodes, and those were some of my favorite moments.
Well, yeah, Hal would hold back. If you listen to all his endings, as he said himself, Phil Spector threatened to splice them all together, just the endings, and release it. And I think that's what he meant by "Hal, do your thing." I can remember when we were recording one of the original versions of Racing in the Street. One of the records that was referenced, one of the songs that was referenced was Surf City, which of course Hal played on too. And I had the privilege. I had the real privilege of playing with the Beach Boys many times. And one of the first times I played with them was in New Jersey, and I wanted to play "I Get Around" and fun. And they did. And Al Jardine came over to me and he said, fun. That hasn't felt like that since Hal played it. Because I played exactly Hal's drum part. If you listen to the Beach Boys' Dance, 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 in 1965, one of the most creative, broken up drum parts. Very, very different for the time, particularly when Ringo was the drummer to emulate. Same time, this stuff was orchestral in its approach. And, when you're given a drum chart, Dave and Jim, it's a very generalized roadmap. It's up to the drummer, whoever it is, to bring that part alive. Unlike any other instrument, if you're given a chart, what the Wrecking Crew started to do is every guy started to add a little bit of their own creativity to these records, particularly when you're working with producers like Brian Wilson and Phil Spector, who knew what they wanted, and knew how to get the most out of you. Hal in The Big Beat says that Phil would have him, he wouldn't have him play. He'd run down everything for hours without Hal playing, and Hal would be getting frustrated. He wanted to play. And finally he would start working with Hal, and it was like holding back a racehorse. And as I say, Hal had this incredible combination of delicacy and power, drive and relaxation. It's really, really hard to do. And he did it all with a smile. And his jokes. Recently, I back in December, I have done this job for Steve Van Zandt every year with my big orchestra, and I had a list of Hal's jokes with me. It was December 18th, and I said, Steve, I got to get you on his email blast list. So I called Hal, and I said, you've got some big fans out here. I got a couple of names and emails if you would kindly put them on your list. And so he did. And they started getting jokes. And so some of them were outrageously politically incorrect. And but they were all just really, really funny. And I don't know if anybody really knows this, but Hal started when he got back from the service. He started there's an area where he grew up that's very much like the Catskills Borscht Belt, with comics, Jewish comics mainly, and musical acts. It was back in the early 50s, mid-50s, and Hal was known as a drumming tumler. A tumler is a guy who tells jokes and warms up the audience, but he played drums. And one of my prized possessions is a tape that Hal sent me, and then he didn't even know who did this tape, but it's a drummer who has obviously a mic around his neck, and it's called How to Play a Show. and Hal sent this tape to his close friends who were drummers, and it's the funniest thing you've ever heard, because it's a vaudeville drummer, and when a dancer kicks, you hit the cymbal, and he demonstrates as he's running down how to play a show. So Hal's sense of show business, as opposed to just sort of musical drumming, came through in everything he did. As he said to me and many others, he got hungry for gold. He went into the studio. There wasn't a moment where he didn't want a gold record, as evidenced by walking into his office, and instead of wallpaper, he had, these framed gold records, all in the same frame, all butted up against each other. And I've been so fortunate to play on records that have been successful, but to have hundreds of gold singles,
man,
that is something I don't think anybody's ever done. Hal once gave me, and I have in my archives, his typed out list of every song he ever played on. And, the numbers range from what I've been reading from, 6,000 to 40,000. It actually is about 35,000 tracks. Not, most of them weren't hits, but he was so busy, and he was meticulous in his record keeping. And, that was a part of him, he was a cartographer during the Korean War in the Army, and you had to be very precise. And you kind of can see that map-making ability that he evidenced while he was in the service, both in his record keeping and his record making, actually. A fascinating guy, because he just was the history of that particular 10-year era of pop and rock drumming. And I can list 100 Bruce Springsteen songs where, okay, I'm doing Hal there. Yeah, I'm doing Hal over there. It became almost an unspoken thing in the studio with us.
Ever get a complaint about it?
No. I
knew that was the answer.
No, particularly like the endings. And, they say now at the ripe old age we are, they say when when you're 20, in your 20s, your brain is still growing. Certainly, yeah, that's true in my case in terms of drumming. You're trying to figure all this stuff out, and if you're proactive and you're listening and you're analyzing, you do get better, and you discover the beauty of what you're listening to that may have hit you viscerally, but now you're more analytical about what it is that really grabbed you. So I guess it's a bit more intellectual, but when you start analyzing it from my point of view, from a drumistic way, you see that how his level of art was so high, but he made it look and sound so easy. I guess what I'm feeling now, just personally, is certainly the sense of his passing. But there's a phrase that I've heard: "You don't be sorry it's over, be glad it happened." And I kind of feel that because I did have contact with him just a few weeks ago, and so I always felt that not only when I turn on, the radio, usually Sirius number 6, almost, every fifth song is a Hal Blaine number. But those jokes and his notes and, Dear Max, keep swinging on late night, and Dave, I think you know this story, and it's in my book, but when we played at Wembley Arena in London before they tore it down, and I think it was on the River Tour.
Yeah, I remember
we
that night
were,
very well.
Yeah, I forget exactly when it was, but we went back to the dressing rooms afterwards.
Early 81.
Clean up, and 81, right. And at the time, I believe it may have been Terry McGovern or even maybe Jimmy McDuffie, who was working with Bruce, said, go to Bruce's dressing room. So I go in, and Bruce says to me, lay down on the couch. I said, all right, I'll lay down on the couch. There was a couch there. The dressing rooms in that building were a little drab. And so I'm laying down on the couch. He goes, what do you see? I said, well, I see the ceiling. I see the edge of the couch, the end of the couch, and the wall. He goes, well, you see that wallpaper? Pick up the wallpaper. There's a bit of wallpaper that was kind of peeling away from the wall. So I pick it up, and under the wallpaper was a stamp, and it said, Hal Blaine strikes again. It was Hal's stamp, and I asked him about it, years later actually, and he said I think he was playing. He said was playing with John Denver, and wherever he went, he would put his stamp someplace on his chart, so people knew that they were hand notated by Hal Blaine. And it's in fact, when I interviewed him for the Big Beat, I said I had a blank piece of paper. I said, "How can you stamp my paper?" So he stamped it, and that's in the book. It's the authentic Hal Blaine stamp. And the memory that I have of Hal was just a giant among giants, a genius among geniuses who was so professional and musical, and wrapped in a package that was just this very soft-spoken, gracious, generous, dignified guy. And rare combination. He will be, sorely missed. And as they say, the music goes on and we have the music to remember him by. But knowing the man and his generosity to musicians and, my son Jay, he got such a kick out of watching videos. For the last few years, he's been a bit frail. And although he did play, he got up to play. I wasn't there, but people have told me he played at his 90th party at this club. Charlie Watts was there, Jim Keltner, Nancy Sinatra, who was a very, very close, dear friend of his. His first professional, Hal very rarely wanted to go on the road. But in 58 or 59, you'll remember the pop singer Tommy Sands.
Yeah,
Tommy Sands was married.
I don't think anybody else does.
Probably not. But he had a few
good. He was
pop
good.
records, and he was a Frankie Avalon type singer, but a little bit more towards Bobby Darin. Married to Nancy Sinatra, and Hal was his drummer. So, and Nancy even recorded a record called "Drummer Man," which was her singing on a drum solo by Hal. I think Hal also did a record. He did 4 records under his own name. I think one was Drums a Go-Go. And with a name like that, you don't even need any music. And, he was...
I remember Drums a Go-Go. I can remember the cover.
Passing was so imminent. I was shocked. And, he was so looking forward, and he did, looking forward to his 90th birthday party. All of the living members of the Wrecking Crew were there, all of his Hollywood friends, and he had friends from, I'm sure the Watts flew in to be at this thing. And that was just 5 weeks ago. So, he lived a hell of a life, musically and out of the studio. And we won't see that type of musician again. There have been, as Bruce has said many times, there have been pretenders, there have been contenders, but there's only one king of pop and rock drumming, and that's Hal Blaine. And
believe it, folks.
It's for those of us who knew him well, it's really the passing of an era. And for the casual fan, now they'll know that 50 or 60 of their favorite drummers were all the same guy. And what a recorded legacy. I still have that 35,000 hand typed set, song list that he gave me. And I still have his original Hal Blaine Strikes Again stamp. And these are things that I've framed. I treasure them. I treasured his friendship, and I certainly use him as an example of how I would someday like to be musically heard.
Well, you're being heard here. That's for sure. I wanted to tell you that I found yesterday. I found this Hal Blaine. Actually, it was a Wrecking Crew record that I didn't know I had. It's in my computer because it's digitized. And the last track. So the reason I found it is because the last track is called Hal Blaine Joke.
Hal Blaine Joke.
So I look at it. It's 12 seconds long. Now, what joke do you figure it is?
Oh boy!
Yeah, I'll give you the joke. I'll give you the joke. I'll be your straight man.
Okay.
What do you call a musician in a three-piece suit?
Overdressed?
The defendant.
That's really good. I haven't heard that.
Well, that's right. That's how he. But that's, to me, that sort of gets the flavor of him. What I know of him,
the kind of jokes. That is exactly how. I mean, drummer jokes galore, and as he got older, old age jokes. I don't know where he dug them up, but he was an avid. The internet really, for a guy who had such reach as a musician, the internet allowed him to be able to stay in touch with all of his friends and fans who he wanted to, and people all over the world. And if you spoke to anybody on that email blast list, they would say essentially the same things that I have. And, he's a rebel. One of Hal's greatest performances. You go to the end of that song, and I've played that with Darlene Love many times. And I always try, whenever I play a Hal Blaine song, if you don't play the exact beat and fills, you have to, I'm a little bit of a geek about those fills. I want to hear those fills. I don't want to hear anybody's impression of Hal Blaine. I want to hear, if you're going to play He's a Rebel, you play it at the right tempo, and you play it with all those fills, because to me, at my old age, that's how you honor the impact of those songs. It's to us, it's the classical music of our lives in many ways, particularly those of us who've been fortunate enough to go on and have careers as, rock era musicians. These are the classics, and they never get old. They never get tired sounding. Every time you put on Be My Baby, it sounds like the first time you ever heard it, or any of the Byrds stuff, or the Mamas and Papas, the Beach Boys, so many groups you never heard of that Hal played drums for. And later, the John Denver stuff, the Elvis stuff. Hal played the drums for the '68 comeback special. He was in the orchestra for that. And, this last summer we lost DJ Fontana, and now Hal, and it's really the end of an era where the drummers who made records came out of the jazz idiom, and they all wanted to be Gene Krupa or Buddy Rich later on, and they used their talents to create the rhythmic template for pop and rock music. And those of us who are in our late 60s, we really just are carrying the beat for those guys. And I'm not being, falsely humble. I do believe that they lit the way. Drummers like Hal, Earl Palmer, Clem Catini in England, who played on, who was sort of known as the English Hal Blaine. Mm-hmm. Tremendous honor to be called that. Hal was first among equals, and brought his own unique, sunny, smiling approach to everything he did. He didn't play very hard.
And Max, I think that's a lot of the reason why he was first among equals, because he treated people right. And because there was a warmth in his playing you can't have if you don't have it.
His personality was totally in his playing. It was, he was unexpected. Look at the stuff he did with Paul Revere and the Raiders, Hungry, Kicks, all of those hits. You could tell it was Hal Blaine. And if you listen the way I did, you can tell, even if you didn't know who it was Hal Blaine. It was Earl Palmer. In New York, it was Gary Chester or Buddy Salzman. And you and I, Dave, have talked about this in the past. Those guys were making those records. Gary Chester, if he had only played on the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout, he could have retired from, he's in the history books. Boom. Hal always modestly said the beginning of Be My Baby was because his stick got caught in the snare drum. And you're playing 2 and 4 as a rock beat, and he missed the 2. So instead of going boom, 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 he went boom, boom, boom. And there's a mistake in the recording. Going into the last chorus, he doesn't go to the 2 and 4 beat until the second bar of the chorus, which maybe was an edit, maybe it was just straight through linearly. I don't know. But for me, it's one of those little moments of brilliance where the drummer, may have been caught off guard.
There's a quote in here in the Times obituary. You have to see this thing about this thing and what he told whoever did that interview. He said, he said, I didn't want to make it impossible for the people who are coming along after me, so I just skipped it for the rest of the song. Basically, he said I tried not to play it so they wouldn't get all messed up, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it could possibly be true, but.
Well, I think by the time Hal got to play the part, and Phil Spector was such a genius orchestrator and arranger that, they worked on those things for a long time. It wasn't just sit down and let it roll. They were highly arranged, charted out, and very professional recordings. And they sound that way. There's a great audio recording of Phil Spector rehearsing Hal. And Phil Spector, in his kind of high, reedy voice, is trying to get him to do something. He goes, no, Hal, play on the regular drum. Referring to the snare drum, right? Play on the regular drum. And to hear him say it, it's really funny. It probably doesn't translate as I'm speaking it, but play on the regular drum. But if you're a drummer, you know what that means. Yeah, it's the Jimmy Vivino played that tape for me. Jimmy, the great arranger of the late night programs we did, who took over the band after I left the show. We were such fans of that stuff. That was, Hal never came on the show to play, but we did have Earl Palmer on the playing with the Max Weinberg 7. And, in the early days, I would just invite all my favorite drummers in to sit in with that band so I could get to see them play up close. And when I saw Earl Palmer played and I watched his feet, suddenly all the Little Richard records from the bottom made sense to me because he was a dancer. And if you listen to the Little Richard records, it's Earl, because he's doing these little upbeat, kind of bebop-y dance beats with his right foot. A little technical, but how taste of
something.
honey.
That's how people get an education in this area of life. Is somebody tells them that, and then they go back and they listen and study it. How did you learn?
Well, I've always enjoyed analyzing these things and listening to the beauty of it. And I don't know whether I ever mentioned this, but before we recorded Born to Run, I sat for hours with the album Born to Run. I sat for hours with Bruce in his bedroom at this little cottage that he rented, listening to rock records, him pointing out what he loved about the drums on The Wanderer by Dion, Cinnamon Girl by Neil Young, the way the drummer played the hi-hat. And, you know, it was, and we were about to go record this material, and I'd only known Bruce at that point and been in the band about 9 months. So it was kind of a primer in what he liked and what, you know, where he was kind of guiding me to play. And he never said, play it like this. It was just, let's listen to this stuff. I also did that with John Landau, listened to a lot of what what he and what Bruce considered great drumming, whether it was Al Jackson or any of the other, a dozen other drummers that they would pick out the work that they did. So it really opened my eyes. It was, when I joined the E Street Band in 1974, I was kind of sort of a half-molded lump of clay. And I had a lot of potential, and I'm glad that Bruce and Steve and John, who were producing all those records, saw the potential. Always had a lot of energy, but energy will get you just so far. You have to, at some point, develop finesse and taste and the ability to see the big picture. And, we're talking about Hal Blaine, and that's something that he was born full grown. He didn't grow up on record. First record, it was a hit. And that's if nothing else, that's an amazing accomplishment. But of course, he was one of the few drummers, instrumental drummers who was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Grammys. I mean, he holds records, Hal Blaine does, from recording and drumming associations that will never be broken by anybody else. That business doesn't exist anymore. And, there were no modern drummer magazines. There was no drumming magazine. To get on the cover of Look, which was, the sort of almost sister magazine to Life magazine, I was very impressed. It was 69, so I was 18. And there, I just saw it on the newsstand, a guy standing next to his Rolls Royce with drumsticks. So, hey, I want to be that guy.
Wow.
Who's that? And, it was most impressive. And, I just love the stuff he did with the Beach Boys. I mean, just endlessly creative. We could go all day again once we start talking about drummers in general and music in general, but Hal specifically. This is a guy who was, I'm sure, smiling, laughing, making other people feel good till he took his last breath. And, I'll always consider him a close friend and a mentor. And my son feels the same way. He would reach out when my son became a pretty well-known drummer, and then became very well-known with Slipknot. Jay Weinberg knows Hal Blaine. He knew who Hal Blaine was. And Hal knew him, and he just got such a kick out of, my son carrying on the tradition, because that's particularly with drummers, and I guess it's like that with all musicians, but we reference those who have come before us, in drum set drumming all the way back to Baby Dodds in the 20s, after William F. Ludwig invented the drum pedal. So now you could sit down and play the bass drum instead of strapping it on your chest and hitting it with, both hands.
Because it was a marching band instrument until then, basically.
Yeah, so, and the beat is basically the same, and to reach the level that Hal did, both success and, impact is remarkable. And when I listen to the licks that I've stolen, I can point to Ringo, I can point to Charlie Watts, I can point to the guys who came before me who I learned, who really kind of established the vocabulary of rock and pop drumming. And if you listen to Hal's drumming closely, you notice he's not playing hard. he's not banging on the drums. He's caressing the drums. He's getting a real light but driving approach. And I challenge anybody to try to do that, to play really driving but not hard. I think it was Art Blakey, the great legendary jazz drummer, who said, the hardest thing in the world is to play intensely soft. Hal Blaine could do that.
Well, it sounds like that was sort of a description of Hal Blaine's personality.
Yes, intense but soft. Well, Hal...
Because they weren't mean jokes.
Oh, no, his jokes were never mean. They were just, most of them were not of this, of 2019, let's say.
Yeah.
And some were just funny. There were a lot of golfing jokes, and he was a sailor. He was into boats throughout his life, and there's a great story that made the drummer rounds. Is I think in about 3 weeks I'm sitting in with the Buddy Rich band at the Cutting Room on April 7th, I believe it is, and Kathy Rich, Buddy Rich's daughter, is a singer, and she fronts the band. She tells a story. It's a great jazz band. But when she was about 15, she did an album. And Hal was hired to play on Kathy Rich's album, play the drums. Buddy Rich was producing the record. So they did all the songs, probably in 2 afternoons. And at the end of the sessions, here's Buddy Rich, Hal's, Godhead, Buddy Rich. And he said, Buddy, why didn't you play the drums? He goes, hey, Hal, it's simple. I wanted the best.
Wow.
So he hired Hal.
Wow. Max, we're running out of time, but I'm assuming there'll be some Hal Blaine songs when you go out with Max Weinberg's Jukebox in April?
Yeah, we're starting to get real busy in April through October, and almost every other song is a Hal Blaine
you just
vehicle. So if you're, I'm so, of course I already miss him terribly, but I'm so delighted to see the notice that, people are finally finding out, the casual listener, who all those drummers were. There were 100 of them, and they were all named Hal Blaine.
Wow. It's kind of like his last gift to you is that you get to go out and tell some of these stories to a live audience now.
Well, yeah, I feel that strongly. I've been fortunate to meet so many of my musical heroes throughout my life, and I guess I sought them out, and they were very generous with their time and their stories. And I'm a fan. I've never stopped being a fan, and when I play the drums, it's one of the reasons I keep playing when the E Street Band isn't playing, because when I play them, I feel like I'm 12 years old, playing in my room to be my baby and learning how to do that. And it's the only time in a 68 years old life where I feel like that. 12 years old. I have that kind of enthusiasm. It never gets tiring for me. And, the concept of my little band is Jukebox is we play the songs people want to hear. It's all audience requests, and I mentioned before, they're all those classic hits. They say the 30s was the classic era of movies. Well, the 60s and early 70s certainly were that in rock and roll. The 50s, of course, but 60s captured a particular moment where it became so widespread. And a guy like Hal Blaine, leading the way, and the other players he played with, Tommy Tedesco, all the great players that went in and out of the Wrecking Crew, listen, Steve Van Zandt and I agree that anybody who uses 3 bass players on a 45 single is okay in our book. Phil Spector and Brian Wilson.
Max, thanks so much for joining us this morning on Live from E Street Nation. Thanks for educating us on the life of Hal Blaine. So many great stories. Thank you so much.
See you when you're back out on the road, man.
It's always a pleasure.
And MaxWeinberg.com is where you can go to find out when Max is taking the Jukebox out on tour. April 6th in South Orange Performing Arts Center is when they kick off the date. Max, we'll be talking with you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.